We can have you find your seats. We'll go ahead and get started this afternoon. Glad you're all here on this moist spring afternoon. I'm Rick Alloway. I'm an associate professor in broadcasting in the College of Journalism and Mass Communications. We welcome all of you to the 2024 Seline Lecture. Today's talk is called Navigating the Nexus, Journalism, Public Relations, and American Politics, and it features Todd Purdum, who covered the Clinton White House for the New York Times, and Mike McCurry, who served as a press secretary for President Clinton. The Seline Lecture Series, which began in 1992, encourages journalism innovators and thought leaders to gather to discuss, to explore, and debate challenges facing our various industries. The lecture series was established in honor of S. Allen and Kathleen D. Seline, who were dedicated to helping future generations of Nebraskans and who were devoted to their children, Steve, Nancy, and Rex. We're honored to have a couple of J School grads in the family too, with Rex and Libby Seline. And Dean Sherry Vale tells me that we are going to claim Becky Seline as a grad as well moving forward. We're deeply thankful to the Seline family for its investment in Nebraska journalism through this lecture series, as well as in Walnut Media, based in Omaha. The Seline family legacy continues to inspire and empower the next generation of media and communication professionals. And now we'd like to invite Nancy Seline Foster to come forward and say a few words on behalf of the family. Nancy?
Thank you so much, Rick, and thank you all for being here. You honor me, you honor our family by being here for this lecture. Kay and Al Seline were children of the greatest generation, which of course means they lived through two of the greatest events, two of the most tragic events in this country's history, the Great Depression and then World War II, as children and then as teenagers and young adults. They came through that, and they are part of the greatest generation, not just because they came through that, but because in coming through that, they became convinced that they could help build a better world. And they would do that by inspiring their children and their grandchildren and all of our friends to do better. And they thought they could do that by three things: ensuring that we had experiences that gave us resilience. So being on the softball field, being in Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, my brothers and I had wonderful childhoods, but each one of those experiences taught us a lesson about resilience, about being able to do something that we thought we couldn't do, and about being really, really inventive in how we moved forward. They thought they could do that by making sure we had skills that would last a lifetime. One of those skills, my dad was absolutely insistent that I take a typing class. You all probably never took a typing class, right? But in middle school, they taught typing in Omaha, Nebraska. He also insisted that I take drama so that I could have stage presence, like today. What do I do for a living? I create documents by typing, and I give speeches. So those two resilient characteristic skills have created a lifetime of work for me. Not the work I ever thought I was going to do when I was in high school, but my dad had a vision, and he knew that those basic skills would last a lifetime. So score one for the greatest generation, because I never would have picked those two things to do. And the third thing they wanted us to do was learn from those who had had experiences well beyond our own, to listen to the stories of people who had been in the room, who'd been part of major decision-making, and to take away the lessons that they learned to help make our own lives better. Today, you have the privilege of listening to two people who've literally been in the room, who've literally been part of major decisions for this country. And I commend you to listen to them and to take away the lessons learned to make your own lives better and pass this on along. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Well, as we approach what promises to be another potentially contentious presidential election, we've invited two distinguished veterans of politics who have played at the highest levels to share their insights with you this afternoon on that relationship between press and politicians. In nearly 25 years at the New York Times, Todd Purdum went from copy boy to White House correspondent to Los Angeles bureau chief. He later was a staff writer for Vanity Fair, Politico, and The Atlantic. He's the author of 3 books, most recently Something Wonderful, Rodgers and Hammerstein's Broadway Revolution. He's taught at the University of Southern California and is currently at work on a biography of Desi Arnaz. Purdum met his future wife, Dee Dee Myers, while covering the Clintons. She preceded McCurry as the White House press secretary. And a sidebar for any West Wing fans in the audience, Todd and Dee Dee's relationship inspired the plot line in The West Wing between fictional White House press secretary C.J. Craig and fictional journalist and reporter Danny Concannon. Before joining the White House, Mike McCurry served as press secretary for Senators Harrison Williams and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, as well as presidential candidates John Glenn, Bruce Babbitt, and our own Bob Kerrey. He was communications director for the Democratic National Committee from 1988 to 1990, and then joined Public Strategies Washington as a consultant. He was also former co-chair of the Commission on Presidential Debates and has taught at the Wellesley Theological Seminary for 8 years before retiring in 2023. In accepting the invitation to join us here today, McCurry noted, "Americans need more civil dialogue," and boy, we couldn't agree more. We're going to introduce them here in a second. I'm going to ask if Zach is still in the room to see if maybe we can't see if we can lower the temperature a little bit. I feel like I'm about ready to drop a ring into Mount Doom here this afternoon. Otherwise, we'll encourage you to please join us in welcoming Todd Purdum and Mike McCurry to the 2024 Seline Lecture.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you to the Seline family for having us here. It's a pleasure to be in Lincoln today, and it's a pleasure to be here with my old friend and colleague, Mike. I can't resist saying here on a campus that Mike and I have a campus connection as well. We both went to college at Princeton, and one of the first things I heard in my freshman year from my resident advisor was that her resident advisor had inspired her to become one because he was a wonderful guy named Mike McCurry. So I feel like I've been linked in a great chain of being with Mike for more than 40 years. And when I went to Washington ultimately and wound up covering the White House, it was a pleasure to meet him. I think both of us agree that it's an important time, more than ever maybe, to understand the nature of the relationship between politicians and the press, and the White House and presidential politics in particular. It's a relationship that by its nature is adversarial and has to be adversarial. But I think we both pretty deeply believe that it doesn't have to be antagonistic. And so I guess, Mike, I'd just like to start by asking you, we're just going to interview each other, so I'm just going to start, but why is it important that the presidency and politicians more broadly have an effective, ongoing, working relationship with the free press?
Well, I think part of the reason is that it's so fundamental for people to have access to content that allows them to make decisions, to have opinions, to form their own beliefs about the direction of the country. And it requires, I think, 2 things. One is there has to be an acknowledged public right to know. The public has a right to the information that is critical to them, that the government maintains and needs to make available. And then concurrently, the government has an obligation to tell. I think the obligation of the White House to present someone, if it's not the president, every day, to answer questions and to be available.
Get your mic.
Is it on or not?
We're not hearing you. So.
It's on the front, so we can do it. It's out to the sides.
See, maybe you could give me a hand. There we go. Much better. I can hear myself. So the thought is that there has to be some process by which the White House and the people in power and the president himself or herself is held accountable for the use of their power. And that is the role that we have assigned to the media, to the press. And I think it is important, as Todd said, that relationship, because it is adversarial and is designed to be adversarial, it's you know, us and them. It is 2 different sides of a public information equation. But it needs to be amicable. It needs to be one of respect that you respect the job that the journalist does, the journalist respects the work that goes into trying to provide answers to legitimate questions. And when that breaks down, you can see what the consequences are. You get people calling the press fake news or enemy of the people. You see a lot of mistrust build in the relationship. And you see an erosion of the ability of Americans to really trust the content that they're getting. Now, coupled with that, and Todd, maybe we can talk a little bit about that, has been the decline in what we think of as the mainstream media. Circulations down, audiences for major network broadcasts down, local newspapers around the country going out of business. And that creates kind of a dearth of information that people need in order to make rational decisions as citizens. So what happens is they migrate to places where they sort of feel comfortable, or they know they more or less agree with what they're seeing on social media sites and places that they go. I think that the experts call this confirmation bias, that they look for the information that confirms what they already think, rather than being challenged by information that might cause them to question some of their assumptions and their prejudices and beliefs. So that is a fragile place that we're in right now. When people say that this election coming up will be one that really tests our democratic system, I believe that's true, because I believe there are many ways in which this could come off the rails, and we could go into this really polarized environment that's kind of maybe not a violent civil war, but something approximating that kind of disagreement and contention. Or we could go to a place where maybe we all act a little more rationally and a little more thoughtfully. And I think that will depend, one, on how the candidates behave, two, if they debate, since I'm obviously had a role in some of the debates, and three, whether the media will give the candidates and the public a place where they get accurate, good information that allows them to really form opinions and make decisions.
You know, almost 30 years ago when we were at the White House, it seemed like a pretty contentious environment. Newt Gingrich and the Republicans had taken control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years, and he was doing pitch battle with Bill Clinton. But they actually managed to get together to do things, and in hindsight, it seems like a kind of golden age era of good feeling. I think you used to say, when you were press secretary, that you saw your job as working 51% for the president and 49% for the press. And I'm not sure President Clinton always agreed with that balance, but you really did see that you had two constituencies that you had to serve. And I think I speak for my colleagues in saying that you tried very hard to serve us, and through us, idealistically, theoretically, the people. You also said once, I think, that you saw your job as to tell the truth slowly. And I mean, I just wonder, like, if you could talk a little bit about, neither you nor I is in the White House every day anymore, but we see what the atmosphere is like, and just a little bit about the differences between now and then for people who might not really remember what it was like.
Well, we were talking about the West Wing. The geography of the West Wing is kind of interesting. The press secretary's office has a front door where guys like Todd would hang out waiting for me to come make some pronouncement. But conveniently, it had a back door, and you could go out the back door. If you turned right, 50 feet away, you were in the Oval Office. If you turned left, 50 feet away, you were in that briefing room that many of you see on television. And to me, geographically, that kind of explains the nature of the job, because you are sort of equidistant between these two potentially important, pivotal sources of power in our system. And you have to keep them happy, although you are correct that if you weren't putting a little extra percentage point on the president's side, you'd hear about it, which I frequently did. As in, you and your friends in the press are trying to destroy every last good thing in America. Not that I'm pretending to be a certain person, but, and then at the same time, you'd go down to the press briefing room and you'd say, why are you guys stonewalling us? Why are you not telling us what we need to know? Now, that goes to the point that you made. The comment that I made about telling the truth slowly was a question from the Venerable Helen Thomas, when she asked me once, is it ever proper for the press secretary to lie? And I said, never, but sometimes you have to tell the truth slowly. Now, what I meant by that is that, you know, I was read into an awful lot of information, you know, classified, top secret, you know, compartmentalized information, not because I was going to go out and blab it to the press corps, but because you need to know the truth in order to make sure that you're never steering anyone away from it. So I felt always that my job was, if I couldn't say everything that I knew, like, oh, by the way, we're going to launch a missile attack tomorrow at 2 o'clock, so you may want to be around. You know, there are things like that you cannot do. But on the same time, you can't inadvertently create a falsehood. There are rare examples when press secretaries have told a lie, and they always pay some kind of price for it. Jody Powell, I'm thinking, when directly asked point blank if there was a rescue attempt for the hostages being held in Iran, and he said no, when in fact there was. But he was protecting operational security at that time. So I found that, I don't know if you were at Martha's Vineyard when we conducted the cruise missile strike on Osama bin Laden while President Clinton was on vacation. It was a great story. So the press corps is all in their swim trunks and golf togs because they were looking forward to having the afternoon off. And meanwhile, I said, well, all hell's going to break loose here and we're going to war in about an hour and a half. But I had to do the briefing. And there's a process with the press corps where they asked to have a lid put on, which means that there's no more news for the rest of the day.
Which seems like the quaintest possible. I mean, I don't know that they're even tried.
I don't even know if they tried it. It used to be that you could actually have a thing called the news cycle, and that doesn't exist anymore. But anyhow, so the reporters kept saying, can we have a lid? And I said, no, you can't. But so I said, I've got a few things I need to check. Now, I could have said, oh, we'll get one shortly, or so. You know, I could have said something that would have made the reporters think later that I had cheated them with misinformation. And that is the delicate balance in the job, trying to find the right way to steer people towards information that is accurate and authentic, and head off material and information which is not useful because it's false.
Well, you make a really interesting point, and since I think there are students here who are also in public relations and may someday be serving their private sector clients or their public clients, one of the things that I think many people don't understand about your job is you have to be a reporter too. You have to be a reporter internally in the government. And maybe you could talk a little bit about just what your daily routine was like, how you began your information gathering every morning and what you did.
Yeah, well, it began with a walk in my neighborhood, not far from where Nancy Foster lives. And I would walk the dogs and listen to the BBC and then to NPR, and you know, capture some of the news, get home with the dogs, go through the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and Washington Times, which I had delivered at the house. Still old-fashioned, I still get newspapers plopped on the driveway every day. But I would go through all of that and then get ready to go down to the White House. And I would say in the shower, I had 90% of the press briefing in my head by then, because I sort of knew exactly what the questions would be. I had a pretty good idea of how I was going to respond. But then I'd go down to the White House. We had a senior staff meeting every morning in the chief of staff's office. And everyone would go around and talk about their day. And I would say, okay, here's what I think the questions are on my test today. And here's what I propose as the answer. And the good thing is that we could kind of adjust and tweak. And it was sharing. Other people around the room could say, oh, well, we've got a meeting on the Hill later today, so you better say this or that or the other. So it was a way in which you could kind of get plugged into all the other things going on. And then, then I would just cram. I mean, it'd be like, I know you guys have got finals coming up. It would be just like cramming for a final, because I would go through papers and memos and read stuff and go down to the Situation Room and talk to the guys who were on duty and ask them if anything was going on in the world, and read, you know, the President's Daily Brief and the National Intelligence Digest, and then get it all in my head. And then I would go see the President. If I hadn't had an opportunity by that time in the morning to talk to President Clinton, we'd go into the Oval Office, and I'd go through my briefing book. and I would say, okay, here's what I'm going to say about this, here's what I'm going to say about that, and it was really, really important because Clinton would dial me to whatever frequency he wanted me to be on. And remember, nobody really cared what my opinion was on things. They wanted to know what the president thought and what the president's decisions were. So that time spent with him to really accurately reflect what his thinking was, I think, probably the most valuable part of the preparation.
I can't remember, did you take a binder with you to the lectern usually? Or?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But I don't remember you very often having to look at it.
I had a binder, and it had what's called the official guidance, so there were talking points. You know, occasionally there'd be some esoteric subject where I would need it, but my staff, it was big black binder, and I would open it up, and they had on the front page laminated a thing that said, "Pretend they're all naked."
You know,
and that would always make me chuckle, but I think trying to keep, you know, some measure of being calm. And we had, you know, you remember, we had we had some heated exchanges from time to time, but I think we did try to keep that relationship professional and amicable.
well, for one thing, it had to resume the next day.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a constant. So one of the things I want you to ask me questions, but President Biden has come under a fair amount of criticism for having hardly any organized formal press conferences. And so often we think of those things as performance art, and there is a performative element. Certainly President Reagan and President Kennedy were brilliant at it. But you were saying to me the other day, what is the substantive importance of those kinds of exercises for focusing a president's thinking and for actually affecting real life issues?
Yeah, I mean, I strongly believe presidents ought to have press conferences on a regular basis. And the reason is, yes, because the media, the press, needs to have access to the president, needs to hold him accountable. However, the preparation for one of those press conferences is usually quite elaborate. We would sit around in the Roosevelt room, and usually Vice President Gore would join President Clinton, and we would, you know, go through all the anticipated questions and go through what the suggested answers were coming from the various agencies and cabinet departments of government. And sometimes, I mean, to be quite honest with you, sometimes President Clinton would say, well, that's just bullshit. And I'd say, yeah, that's your policy. and it would then trigger, he would pick up the phone and call Donna Shalala or call someone and say, you know, we're going to have this question at the press conference, and we got to have a better answer than that. So it was action forcing. The fact that you had to stand up and have better answers meant that you had to have better policy. And I really do believe that was one of the fundamental important reasons why you do these press conferences, because it makes the wheels of government work more efficiently and work better.
You had one of the longest tenures of modern press secretaries. Marlin Fitzwater was longer, but you had, I think Wikipedia says, 3 years and 225 days. And as you were standing there looking at us naked, thinking of
Not you, Todd.
well, I was in the third row on the aisle, I think. What do you think was the secret of being able to do it? And you had, as Rick noted, you were there we were both there during some pretty tough times, and particularly the Lewinsky impeachment issue. What was the secret of your success?
I mean, it was surely my wife, my best friend, my family. It was the ability to find the off switch at the end of the day, which you made the point earlier. I'm not sure press secretaries can do that anymore because the news just flows incessantly, and with social media, there's never any end to the day. But at the end of the day, I could go home, I could turn off the switch, I could be with my kids who were still pretty little at that time, and just be away from it until I got up early the next morning to start it all over again. And I think that was a key to it. And the other thing was just to not take myself too seriously. I got asked in one of the classes earlier, you know, what's the most important lesson learned, and it's to be humble. You know, to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God, as Micah the prophet said. I think that is fundamentally the important thing, to have a good sense and awareness of self and not let ego get in the way of the work that you've got to do.
Well, you did have, I mean, as you know, as Tell the Truth Slowly indicates, you had a marvelous sense of humor. So, all right, what do you want to ask me?
Well, I'm curious about your own sense of how the media has changed. I mean, we've talked a little bit about, from my side of the podium, some of the changes I saw, but what have you seen or sensed as changes in the press corps, particularly the White House press corps, since the time that you were there in Washington?
Well, it's just more contentious, first of all. There's less time for reflection. I mean, when I was working at the New York Times, you usually had, not always, because sometimes news broke very late in the day, but you could have 4, 5, 6 hours to figure out what you were going to make of the day's events. Now you might have 6 minutes, and news organizations post little storylets all the time about a few paragraphs at a time. Everybody's like the old, in the old days, the wire services of AP or UPI, the instantaneity of information has changed. And there's also just a degree of rancor in general. Circumstances and personalities have forced the press to actually have to, like, in so many words, call the President of the United States a liar. And that's been something that's really changed. That's been a radical change, I think. And then I think there's also, in newsrooms, like the New York Times, when Rex and I worked there 40 years ago, had about 1,000 people in the news gathering organization. And after 2008 and the recession, it shrunk. And now it's bigger than ever. I think it has roughly 1,500 people in the news gathering operation. But a large portion of those are people who come from the world of audience development and market research, and do not have what I would consider a journalistic sensibility or a journalistic background. And the other thing that's happened in the business model of the paper and of much of journalism is it's not a news organization that's dependent on an advertiser subscription balance. The New York Times has 10 million digital subscribers, and it depends on having them pay to read the New York Times. So I think there's more of a tendency than there used to be to play to confirmation bias and give the readers what they want. And when Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes realized that there was an audience for Fox News, they basically exploded the notion of your old boss and my teacher, Senator Moynihan, that everybody's entitled to his own opinions but not to his own facts. And Fox decided, we will give you red facts. And the heck with the blue facts, you know, take your blue facts and we'll give you the red facts. And then MSNBC said, well, we'll give you the blue facts. And now there's just increasing partisan journalism in every corner. Years ago, Michael Kinsley, a very thoughtful Washington journalist who was at one point the editor of the New Republic, used to argue that this model of American journalism that grew up after World War II, of kind of objective journalism in which the editorial page and the opinion should be separate from the news pages, which was really counter to most of American journalism. I mean, for most of American journalism, you knew what a newspaper, the Los Angeles Times was the opinion of the Chandler family, and the Chicago Tribune was the McCormicks, and they had their views. And
Were they aligned with
they were aligned with a political party. And in the case of Abraham Lincoln, if you read the 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates, the Republican papers cover one way and the Democratic papers covered Stephen Douglas the other. And so, but now I think there's so anyway, Mike Kinsley used to say that the American press should be like the European press and be more overtly partisan. And I always felt like, well, maybe you should be careful what you wish for, because it's sort of what we have now. And I think that's kind of a problem. And I don't know, is that responsive to your question? The tenor of the whole thing is just different.
Well, it also strikes me that the economic model
Has driven
for
part of that,
journalism
yeah.
has driven a lot of this, because it's very difficult to make money. And you see now local newspapers around the country going out of business, which I think there are devastating consequences for that, because you know, government that's closest to the people is usually local government. And if there's no coverage of that, and those city councilmen or county supervisors are not being held accountable, then you're losing something in that part of the equation too. But what have you heard of, seen of, know of any successful different ways of getting revenue to produce quality journalism?
No, I mean, there are organizations like ProPublica, which have a nonprofit model that can do deeper dives of investigative work. You know, the New York Times has managed to thrive by having ancillary products like Wordle and Spelling Bee and the cooking app, which is, driving enormous numbers of readers to subscribe. And that's also an ancient journalistic tradition. I mean, papers had the funny papers to get people to subscribe, or crossword puzzles or whatever. But I think it's a challenging reality, and in the end of the day, for a news organization of any kind, profit or nonprofit, to thrive, it has to have consumers. It has to have readers. And like my kids are 20 and 20, almost 21 and 24, and they read content from the New York Times, but they read it because it comes to them on their social media feeds. They don't go to the homepage of the NewYorkTimes.com and look at whatever's there. And so that, we were talking earlier when I covered the White House. Time and Newsweek, the weekly news magazines, were a major force in journalism. They were part of the traveling press pool. They paid for seats on Air Force One, and under the press charter. And those news organizations don't exist anymore. Similarly, every major state had a presence in the Washington bureau. I mean, it had the Omaha World Herald or the Tulsa paper, or you name it. They all had correspondents in Washington filing for the folks back home, and by and large, that doesn't exist anymore. So I think it's really a challenge. There are fewer and fewer outlets covering the same information, and then in the case of state capitals all over the country, there's just been a collapse in the press corps. And as you say, if you don't cover the sewer board or the school board or the place where, people's most basic municipal services are handled, you kind of lose the culture of accountability. And I think it's also, you lose the whole culture of the notion that people should be held to account. So, if somebody's used to, if politicians who've come up through the normal system are used to being held to account at every level, then when they become president or something, they're not surprised that they're being held to account. But we now have this strange phenomenon in which we basically had a celebrity become president for the first time in history, who had dealt with the press in a very particular way, and never felt particularly accountable to the press in the normal way that an elected official would, and that's had its consequences.
I want to switch subject a little bit, and something personal to me. As you know, before I got to the White House, the daily press briefing was not available for broadcast, was not on television. And then I changed that kind of arbitrarily. I never asked permission to do it. I just one day said, well, it's kind of unfair to the broadcast reporters. It was actually Mark Knoller, who was a radio reporter. And he came to me and said, look, I'm at a disadvantage because my print colleagues can, they can use your quotes, they can print, but I don't have sound, and I have to have sound in order to do my daily hour-by-hour reports. And I said, well, that's a sensible argument. So we just kind of turned the lights on, and off it went to broadcast. My question to you was, did that end up being a bad decision?
Well, when President Eisenhower first decided to allow delayed televised coverage of news conferences, the caveat was they could be filmed, but then he and Jim Hagerty, as press secretary, had to review the film, and they could selectively release what they wanted to release or not release it. It was President Kennedy who first held live, real-time press conferences, and they tended to be in the afternoon. So I think the print press I always felt that the TV reporters often had to ask you a purposefully contentious question to get the best answer they could out of you, which would make a good soundbite for television. It wasn't as important for me because I could call you 5 hours later and we could have a quick phone conversation and you could tell me something that was more meaningful than what you could say in public. But it's an interesting question. What you couldn't have anticipated was shortly after you made that decision, the Lewinsky scandal came along, and you became Court TV, kind of like, Access Hollywood, or whatever you want to say. It was all one blended thing all of a sudden, and I think that...
One quick story about that. At one point, when I stipulated that I was not going to say anything new, and CNN was saying, Mike McCurry briefing live at 2 o'clock. And I called up Tom Johnson, who's the president of CNN. I said, Tom, I will swear an oath right now that I am not saying anything new on this subject today. It's just going to be more repeat of everything I've been saying for the whole last 5 days. And it was a long pause, and he said, I don't think you understand, you spike 100,000 households when you come on. So it was
Viewership would increase by that much when you came up. People would wait.
They would wait and turn away from the soap operas in order to see the scandal at the White House.
And that must have really surprised you and maybe sobered you.
It did, you know, didn't help that my mother was calling saying, do you really have to go do that again today?
You know, that brings up something. I think one of the things that's...
Anyhow, I interrupted your answer, though. What I asked myself is, did I turn that into a theater of the absurd by having it, by people posturing for the cameras?
Well, you didn't. Some of the correspondents did. I mean, some of the people turned it into a theater of the absurd because I mean, he's a perfectly fine person, so I shouldn't single him out, but there was a reporter named Wendell Goler who used to say to you all the time, are you saying from this podium, as if by just by merely standing there that there should be some... But one of the things that when you talk about your mother, when I went to cover the White House, everybody that I knew thought this must be such an incredibly glamorous assignment. And there were parts of it that were very, you know, especially foreign trips and things like that, were very, you'd pinch yourself. But I think one thing that people don't understand is it's also a drudgery and a lot of hard work and a lot of waiting around and a lot of not very glamorous. And same thing I suspect for you, right? I mean, just a lot of plain hard work.
Yeah, I mean, when there was not stuff going on that you were covering, like if President Clinton was out playing golf and you guys were stuck in the clubhouse because you were on pool duty and you had to be there because someone has to be with the president at all times from the press. But, you know, there was nothing going on. Now, for me, what was going on was usually you were trying to figure out what tomorrow's story was going to be, or try to clean up any mess that you'd made at the briefing that day, or, you know, trying to fill in some of the gaps. But I didn't, you know, you're right, it is a lot of drudgery sometimes, and it's a lot of, you know, we're talking about bureaucracies. We're talking about the functioning of government, which is not instantaneously exciting. And a lot of it was just trying to follow up and understand a process or understand where new regulation was going to be put out and who could you talk to that would understand something about that and explain it. I spent a lot of time talking to people who I thought were knowledgeable, who really knew what was happening. And most of them, by the way, career people who worked in our government, who were not political appointees, but they were the ones who really were smart and knew things. And my father had been a career federal civil servant, so I had respect for that, which earned me a lot of credit with people who could actually help me get the job done, because they didn't think I was some political hack who had come into the White House. I want to tease out a little bit more about what you found most challenging about the work that you had to do as a White House reporter. What were the barriers that you had to overcome? How did you? I mean, I don't want to. You don't have to identify sources, but how did you find ways in which you developed reliable sources of information inside?
Well, I think it was a challenge. And
you want to name names for me?
No, in some ways, I had the worst possible preparation to become a White House correspondent because I'd only been in Washington for about a year, and I'd been covering mostly the Congress, mostly the members of Congress from New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And that was a fabulous job because they all wanted to talk to you. They all wanted to get in the New York Times. Even now, on Capitol Hill, reporters can go roam around the halls of Congress, wait for senators to come out of the chamber by the elevators, buttonhole them in the subway on their way back to their offices, go knock on the door of their offices. In the White House, you're confined to a very small space, the briefing room. You can walk up a small ramp to the press secretary's. There's a lower press office right off the briefing room, and then the main press secretary's office is down a short ramp and hallway. And that's all you can do. You can't walk around the executive office building. You can't walk around the Treasury Department. You have to just stay confined in this little space. So in some ways, the worst place to learn about what's going on at the White House is, for a reporter, is at the White House. And the people who really know what's going on in the White House are scattered all over Congress, the agencies, political consultants and pollsters out in the country, major party donors, other hangers-on, and so I found when I left Washington and went to become the Los Angeles bureau chief of the New York Times, I could talk to California politicians and consultants who would tell me more about what was going on back in the Clinton White House than I had learned sometimes, right there in the same day. So I used to say that in the White House, the hard part for reporters was, and also it was you had a pretty tight administration. There wasn't a lot of malicious leaking, I would say. It was pretty disciplined on message. And, 10 people knew, and 5 people would talk to you, and only maybe 2 would tell you what was, sort of going on. And it was very hard. I mean, on the other hand, the best advice sometimes about covering politics in general is to simply watch what actually happens in public, because you can, what did Yogi Berra say? You can see a lot by watching. And I mean, you can, in fact, if you just see what President Clinton says every day, and especially if you're not focused on trying to make a cheap or instant headline, over time, certain things would emerge, like, oh, he's bringing that up a lot, and then like, oh, that maybe there's a theme there that he's kind of testing out, and he would sometimes road test ideas, like maybe in a speech or something, you wouldn't particularly call attention to it, but he would float some concept or notion or a way of formulating his views about something. The other thing that was hard is you had to listen, you had to always be alert, and a couple of my colleagues and I got famously caught out once in Texas. President Clinton was making a campaign speech, he was raising money, and he had explained to this audience of rich donors in Texas that they probably thought he raised their taxes too much with his economic plan in 1993. And he said, well, it might interest you to know that I think I did too. Well, he had earlier in the speech talked about gun control and how problematic that was as a political issue. And using an earthy phrase, he said, yeah, they cut us a new one here in Texas on that. And I was so obsessed about whether I could get the phrase, cut us a new one, into the New York Times, that I just didn't even pay attention to this. You probably think I raised your, and the Washington Post didn't either, but the Los Angeles Times and Reuters heard this, and they made a big deal about it, and Senator Moynihan went to the floor of the Senate the next morning, and everyone's like, where were you? How did you, and the New York, my boss was like, how did you miss this story? And it's like, well, he says stuff like that all the time. And like, well, then he said it last night and you were there and we paid to send you to Texas and you kind of missed this. So I think the main thing for me was I always lived in fear of what the Washington Post would have, or what would, you seldom felt in the White House, because it was such a competitive beat, that you could really break through or make a big difference unless you failed or you fell down on something, and then you could stand out. But if you just covered the things everyone else covered, everyone would say like, well, okay, that's fine, But if you blew something, it would be very noticeable because it was a high-profile thing.
We want to open it up and let you have a chance to question us, but I want to maybe end my questions by just asking you to project a little bit about, we're obviously going into a very contentious election year. Very hard to kind of imagine what's going to happen. Polls taken now are probably not very helpful in predicting what's going to happen. But particularly in how the press will cover this campaign, how will they hold Biden and Trump accountable? How much attention will they give to third-party candidates who might actually have some consequence if they take votes away from the two front-runner contenders? But how do you see things playing out? Put a little crystal ball together here.
Well, I hung up my crystal ball after 2016, but I think I don't mean this to sound cynical, because it isn't meant to be cynical, but as I'm a lot more distant from daily coverage, pardon me, I think it's just true, it's axiomatic that the press lives to stir the pot. And it's not even conscious. But it's inevitable that, like, if Biden is down, then pretty soon there'll be a cycle where, just as sure as the sun comes up in the morning, the press will find it in its interest to build Biden up, to keep the story going, And if Trump is up, then there'll be some reason to, like, bring him down. And the third-party candidates could make a real difference. I mean, if Bobby Kennedy's on the ballot in Michigan, that could be a really problematic thing. And then the other thing that happens is, I don't know how you feel about this, but the press, like the military, always overlearns the lessons of the last war. So whatever the press ought to be thinking about now, it's probably not. because it's still thinking about 2016 and 2020, and it probably doesn't yet see the unanticipated bends and curves that are on the road ahead. But I think it's, there's just, the press lives to, you have to have conflict, and you have to, I mean, there's a reason that man bites dog is a story and not dog bites man. My boss at Vanity Fair, Graydon Carter, used to say that train wrecks are more interesting than successful journeys. And I think one of the things that, in general, the press is bad about, it's okay about saying what happened. It's not very good about explaining what's happening. Because what's happening today is that hundreds of people are going through the streets of Lincoln, making their way in a somewhat slick, April morning. But other people, it's not like everybody's having a car crash or a disaster. It's just people are living their lives, and somebody got up and fed the dog and had their breakfast. And the press isn't very good about reflecting that part of the ongoing nature of real life. And as you talk about the career officials in Washington, much of what's happening in Washington today is capable, competent handling of the affairs of millions of people whose lives are getting better or worse if there's failure. If the Veterans Administration is not giving you your benefits and the Social Security Administration has screwed up your check, that's really important. And it's something that the press, it isn't always so good about,
Yeah, I never had much success convincing editors and reporters that most Americans would find it newsworthy that actually some things actually do work well in government, and that, reporting on those things is not necessarily a bad thing or contrary to the interest of actually reporting the news.
Yeah.
All right, I lied. I have one last question. We've got an audience of many, many young people here. Is there anything that we could be doing in politics or in journalism to more inspire and engage younger audiences and get them interested in careers in public affairs or interested in
I was going to
careers
ask you
in
that
journalism?
question too. That's a hard question. It's a good question. I don't know. I'd say, my answer to that reflects the views of our children who aren't children. I mean, they're, young adults. But I think Kate and Stephen find it very depressing that American politics is dominated by so many old people, and that they don't feel that they have a voice in politics or people who are representing them, or they think even someone like Pete Buttigieg is an old person's idea of a young person. I mean, and it's just, I guess, sort of like what Mike said earlier about the passage from Micah. I would encourage you to, look for the light and try to listen for the parts of public discourse that make sense to you and that sound decent and thoughtful, and be humble about what you don't know, and also try to consume a lot of different kinds of media. Don't just read the things you agree with. Don't just listen to the radio you agree with. Don't just get the social media or follow the Twitter people X people that you agree with, and realize, I mean, we're counting on you because we've messed it up. I mean, I think you have so many advantages in terms of broader instant reach to information than ever before. There's a lot of bad and dangerous information out there too, unreliable information. But take advantage of the ease of communication to stay in touch with your fellow citizens and with each other, and try not to be cynical about, think that it's, try not to think that it's a rigged game, because at its best it's not. I mean, it doesn't have to be.
All right, with that, we would really like to hear from you all. And there's a microphone here. And just come and line up if you've got a question. Someone be brave and ask the first one.
So if you can come down and use the microphone, that would be very helpful.
Someone be brave and come ask the first question. Otherwise, we have to kind of figure out how to.
Otherwise, you're wasting your parents' tuition. And the Seline's gift. We can keep talking forever. I mean, all we do is, we've had a great reunion here.
I've got two quick ones while we're waiting for people to
Yeah,
come
we
down.
got one.
Okay,
Oh,
Rick.
come down. Like to hear yours first.
Hi, I'm Marissa. I'm a sophomore journalism and broadcast major. It's my own tuition money, not my parents'.
Good for you.
I was kind of curious about the dynamic between you two. You talked a little bit about times that you've gotten kind of heated. Could you explain an example of that and like how you came back from that the next day? Because I wonder about that with reporting politics, how you repair relationships, especially about some of these contentious issues.
Well, I can explain one that's very embarrassing for me and doesn't reflect well on me at all, which is, I think I can say without any hesitation that Mike never lied to us. But one day in Kansas City, during the 1996 campaign, something was going on, and I think Mike was in the process of, there was a gaggle of reporters around us, and he was trying to tell the truth slowly on something, and he said something about like, well, you know, don't keep pestering me about the same thing. It might have had to do, it was something with Senator Dole and President Clinton, and it was some technical issue about, I can't even remember what it was, but I, without thinking about it, just because, you know, you get your underwear in a bunch, said, well, don't you lie to us then. And those words came out of my mouth, and I realized, ooh, I had said something. And he blushed, and he was really mad. But even worse from my perspective was, having known that I did something really wrong and unfair, a colleague, Michael Kelly, who had used to work at the New York Times and was then working at the New Yorker, or maybe the New Republic, we got on the bus to the next stop, and he came and started questioning me about it. And it was clear that he was thinking about writing about this, and writing about this exchange. And probably he was going to say it was a reflection of how the White House is in trouble, that even the New York Times said to McCurry, don't you lie to us, and blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, not only had I done the wrong thing and said something that I didn't mean about a person that I really respected and cared for, but it was possibly going to become public and embarrass me and embarrass my employer and make me look stupid. And so then the next stop later was in St. Louis, and I apologized, I hope I apologized to you, but you know, then he embraced me in front of the fruit room of reporters in the temporary filing center in the hotel where we were, and I think, you know, our presence here today is a sign that we lived through it. But it's something that really, you know, as Mayor LaGuardia of New York used to say, when I make a mistake, it's a beaut, and that was really a bad thing to do.
You know, one of the customs when you travel, one of the best parts of the job working at the White House was traveling and going to different countries, going to different places, being out on the road and away from the routine of being in the White House. And the custom was that a group of reporters would get together and they would invite White House staffers, me or the National Security Advisor, other people to go out and have dinner with them. And those were really important occasions because they were, by understanding, off the record. And I think that's where, more times than not, that's when I vented. I think I made Maureen Dowd cry one time at one of these dinners. But I would get my frustrations out on the table and say, I don't understand why you guys keep writing this. I don't understand why you don't write that. You know, I would get it off my chest. And of course, they could in turn say, well, if you guys would just be more forthcoming, if you would just produce more people, if you just helped us more in our stories and not always, you know, clam up on things, and we would be able to do a better job. So you'd clear the air a little bit. Now, my impression, I don't know if you've heard differently, my impression is very little of that happens now because when the day is over, all of the reporters have to run back to their rooms and get on Twitter and start posting things, and because it's constant. And they don't have that time to sort of socialize and to build relationships that actually are more professional and make the whole thing work better.
And the truth is, you could never be forthcoming enough to satisfy us, and we could never be reticent enough to satisfy you. So it is a built-in tension. But the other thing that, in my case, I used to regret doing, I would go to the briefing. I shared the White House beat with a colleague, and we would alternate going, but it was my turn to go to the briefing. I would go to the briefing, and I would usually be determined not to ask a question because, frankly, since it was the New York Times, I knew that I would be able to talk to Mike later in the day and ask him maybe something in private that I didn't want to share with everyone else. But the briefing was really, in that sense, partly public theater for the broadcast people to. But Mike might get into a rhubarb with, I don't know, there was one particular reporter, may she rest in peace, Deborah Oren of the New York Post, who would ask kind of really off the wall and contentious questions, and then Mike would get into it with her. And even though I disagreed with her, sort of like taking one for the team, then I'd raise my hand and I'd get into it as well. And I'm like, why did I even do that? Why didn't I just go right back to the office? And So
Well, because you're expressing some solidarity with a
yes, but
colleague.
one thing that's actually really true, and I think this is still true, the White House press corps is, 60 individuals. And so one thing that very seldom happens in a briefing, if like ABC is asking the press secretary a question and he doesn't or she doesn't give a very good answer, CBS doesn't ever say, you didn't really answer her question. They just go on to their question. And if really one after the other got together and said, hey, answer her question, it's reasonable, then I think sometimes that would happen. But there's a lot of ego at play and a lot of.
A quick point, and I know that.
I'm sorry, we're punishing you for standing up there.
Just one quick point. When I was at the State Department, the process for doing the briefing there is methodic, and they get on a topic, and then they go and peel the onion and peel it back and peel it back, and they all stay on that subject. And then it was usually George Getter or Barry Schweid, the two senior AP correspondents. One or the other would say, next subject. And then they'd go into the next subject, and you'd go down through all the questions. Well, at the White House, it's totally different. And I had much more control as press secretary at the White House because I could ping pong, and I'd say, okay, I'm not comfortable with this Todd Purdum line of questioning. So Japanese television, did you have a question about the yen-dollar ratio?
Yeah, ready to answer that, yeah.
So you could bounce her out and change the subject, and you had much more control of it. But there was that's a little bit of inside technique baseball about briefings. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Mitch West. I'm a sophomore in the Ad PR program at the College of Journalism. One of the questions that I've always wondered, especially when representing a country, is the weight of the words that you carry and what those moments are like when you know you're going to be talking about something that carries a lot of that weight, the pressure to know that it's not just the millions of Americans watching and listening to that, but it's also international governments, it's also people from all around the world. What's that like? How did you soften the blow as much as you could?
Good question.
It's a great question. I guess my answer is I would never try to think too much about that because it would have freaked me out. But
You thought about the whole world sitting naked in front of you.
but I think part of it was, I had to affect different postures at different times when I was at the podium, particularly because the questions would jump around on different subjects. So there would be some times when I was wearing a totally political hat, and I was just saying stuff that was, about the campaign or about politics or, trying to get a little spin in on Newt Gingrich or something like that. But then there were other moments, as you suggest, where you had to kind of rise up and speak with some certainty on behalf of the United States of America and on behalf of its president. And those moments, I guess what I tried to do was to affect a different posture. I mean, I would stand up more straighter, and when, I would be much more direct and try to signal, okay, I'm saying something of consequence here now. And I think the reporters knew that. I mean, they knew if I was getting into a certain subject, that was something that was actually pretty important. And so I did it more through body language and through tone of voice than anything else. And also, you could signal. You'd say, I would sometimes say, I now have an important statement I need to read on behalf of the National Security Council, or something, signal that we were moving into something that actually had some consequence.
And it was a visceral signal if you actually read something verbatim rather than just.
Right. And the other thing was, if it was big enough news, and you could see in the back of the room the television cameras, and if the light went on, you sort of knew that you were on live television. And there was a real difference from doing that and just being recorded for being a part of a news story later in the day. So I was very conscious of the times when I knew that I was going to be saying something that was going to be live on television. Now, that was not that often, because if it was a big enough deal, we had the president come in, and the president would make the comment, and that was always much more consequential. And I said earlier today that I just reminding myself all the time to be humble and to not take yourself seriously. That was pretty key to, trying to say something where other people, the people in the country would be sympathetic and say, okay, I trust what this guy is saying. Because I think the minute you stand up there and look like you're putting on a story or a show, I think you lose credibility with the audience that matters most, which are the people at home watching.
I didn't have the same responsibility of moving markets or whatever, but I would think when there was a truly momentous event, I felt like, okay, I'm writing this not just for tomorrow's newspaper, but in some sense for history, and people are going to be looking at this on microfilm. So I do remember, like, during the Florida recount in 2000, being in Tallahassee, and the night that the Florida Secretary of State declared that George W. Bush had won, but Al Gore vowed to continue contesting it. Nothing like that had happened since 1876, and I was searching for a way to convey that in the New York Times, and I came up with some phrase like, setting off extraordinary legal proceedings not seen by any American now living. And just something that nobody is now alive in the country who's ever seen anything like this. And so you definitely put your, the hair on the back of your neck would stand up sometimes when you knew that it was a real deal.
Yeah, I had the reporter for Bloomberg would occasionally bring me a readout of the stock market, and she would say, this is the moment you said X, and look what happened to the market. So that was to put the fear of God in you that you were moving financial markets. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Diego, and I'm a junior here with sports media. I wanted to ask, with the rise of third-party candidates such as Robert F. Kennedy Jr., do you think that this will change the way third-party candidates are covered in political media? I wanted to ask you guys this since you guys must have had experience with Ross Perot and other similar candidates.
Well, I worked in Colorado to clean up my record, having worked for Senator Bob Kerrey during the primary. I worked for Bill Clinton during the general election out in Colorado. And Clinton Gore won Colorado in 1992 precisely because Ross Perot got 19% of the vote there. So these third-party candidates are consequential. Now, one little technical thing, in order to be invited to the debates that are hosted by the Commission on Presidential Debates, which I served as co-chair of, you have to obviously be constitutionally eligible to be elected. You have to be on enough ballots to mathematically have the possibility of getting 270 electoral votes, thus being elected. But the third thing is in a combination of 5 different national polls, you need to be above 15% in national support. So will any of those candidates make that criteria? I think there is maybe a case that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. might, but it's not going to be Jill Stein. It's not going to be Cornel West. It's not, So part of it depends on, do they make it to the debate stage? Because then I think that would have some consequences. There'll be all kinds of haggling about that. There already is. The Trump folks say we shouldn't wait till this September to have debates. We should have debates sooner than that. The Biden people are kind of being loosey-goosey about whether they're going to do the debates or not. I mean, we'll see what happens. I think it's become an expectation of voters and the electorate now that we do have nationally televised debates involving the major candidates. And I think people would be surprised if someone tried to duck it, and I think there might be a political price if a candidate tried to duck these debates. So I suspect we will see that, but I think it's really going to, I think that threshold of 15% is pretty critical, because not only does it impact the debates, but I think that's a measure of whether or not those candidates will have a consequential effect in some of the key battleground states, drawing either from Trump or from Biden, and thus making the electoral count for that state different than it might have been. So, a lot of this is sort of wait and see what happens at this point.
Yeah, everything he said.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. My name is Austin Okorodudu. I'm a grad student in the Integrated Media Communications program here. I'm from Nigeria. I was just going to say that we talk about crisis management in PR. were there times that you kind of ran into major issues in terms of crisis, scandal, while you were at the White House, and how did you handle that? I recall that there's one major crisis or scandal, crisis I would say, with the Bill Clinton administration. What was that like for you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I single-handedly created a few crises myself.
No.
And they all have one thing in common, which is the temptation to rush too quickly to address the situation or the crisis. There is unfortunately not a closet at the White House that is the truth closet. You just go open it and the truth comes tumbling out. Sometimes you need to talk to people, piece things together, understand what the correct response is, and then you have to have someone who's accountable. I think this is generally true for those of you who are studying crisis communications as part of your PR studies. You need to identify who is the accountable person and spokesperson, and I think usually that should be the CEO, the guy in charge, or the woman in charge. You need to make it very clear what you know and what you don't know. You need to make it very clear the process by which you're going to answer questions that are legitimate and acknowledge those questions are legitimate and that you're not trying to duck it. And then the most important thing is you can't try to put a rosy color on information that's just not going to be positive. People make mistakes, organizations make mistakes, corporations screw up, White Houses screw up, presidents, get involved in hanky-panky. There's all kinds of things that can go wrong, but you need to maintain credibility if you're speaking in a public role in all of those situations, and make sure that the information that you're providing is reliable and accurate and as timely as it can be, without forcing a schedule that allows you to say things that end up being wrong. I would say the greatest risk in a crisis is that you try to rush to get information out to make sure everything is all right, and it's not. And it requires more thoughtful approach, and you really have to understand what was the nature of the mistake and the error, and how do you get at it. Remember, it was 8 long months before the time that the Monica Lewinsky story came out and when President Clinton ultimately acknowledged that he had had an inappropriate relationship. That was a long time of sitting there getting pelted with questions every day on the subject, but I had to make sure that I never said something that was inadvertently inaccurate. And some people in the White House did, and they paid a price for it. There are some of my former colleagues at the White House are still paying off legal bills from that time, 30 years later, so.
And from the press's perspective, I'd just say the same thing. You have to be really careful not to leap to conclusions and draw the wrong answers. When the Oklahoma City bombing happened in 1995, there was a tendency, because the World Trade Center first bombing had already happened, there was an immediate sort of worry and tendency to assume that this might be some kind of terrorism, and perhaps particularly Middle Eastern terrorism, foreign terrorism. There was not an immediate assumption that it was domestic, homegrown terrorism. And I remember actually President Clinton being very careful to say, let's just take a breath here, let's not assume anything about this, and the press has to be careful about that. In the aftermath of the raid that killed Osama bin Laden, a whole lot of, in the first 36 hours, a lot of inconsistent information came out, some of it from the White House, some of it, erroneously quickly put out. And obviously, in things like that, military operations, there's always a terrible risk of, that happened during the Iraq War. There was a lot of initially inaccurate information that comes out. So the press has the equal responsibility not to take the story and assume the wrong things.
Just a follow-up. So how short or long does it take for you to do your first response? Because many times we talk about, okay, don't rush to the press or don't say something early. But if you leave that lag or that open door, people can run with anything.
Well, the answer is you have no time. Now you have no time at all. The White House has, when the Berlin Wall went up, how long was it? It took like 3 days until Pierre Salinger, JFK's press secretary, was asked a question about it at the White House.
Right.
And now, if the Berlin Wall went up, it'd be carried live on CNN and every other, outlet in the world. So the answer is, we both said these high-minded responses, but the other part of the graph is you have no time. So in no time, how do you do that?
If you don't have the answers, you have to give process. So if you don't have the answers instantaneously, you have to say, here is exactly what we're doing to try to understand the situation better, so that you're saying something, even if you're not necessarily saying everything you know at that minute.
Thank you.
Time, maybe one more question. We'll let this gentleman get on to 2 o'clock.
I'm Joe Starita, freshman journalism major, a former journalist. Question for each of you. Todd, my question to you is, how would you evaluate how the media are covering Donald Trump? What advice would you give to the media? Are they covering him too much? Are they covering him just right? Are they covering not enough? Can you tell us what your evaluation is of how the media are covering Trump and what advice you would give the media? And Mike, my question to you is, how do you think the Biden camp is responding to Donald Trump, and what advice would you give them in terms of reacting to his comments? Should they be more aggressive? Are they doing got about the right room temperature right now, or should they lower the flame?
What an easy question. Well, I first met Donald Trump probably almost 35 years ago. I was a young reporter at the New York Times working for Rex, actually, and I did a Sunday business profile of Steve Wynn, who was a casino owner in Las Vegas. And he was moving into some new field. He was trying to buy some hotels, and he was in some competition with Donald Trump. And I called Donald Trump for a comment. He was the kind of person you call, because he had his own casinos in Atlantic City. And he said to me, well, he's all right, but of course he can't compare to anything I've done. And I dealt with him as a political reporter because he was a contributor to campaigns in New York. And Donald Trump was the kind of person that you called for a funny comment about the passing parade of life. When he got his marriage license for his second wife, Marla Maples, he came to City Hall to get the marriage license. And I wrote a page 1 story for the New York Times about that happening. And the whole thing was written as a kind of like almost a parody of a society, a news announcement, So I think Donald Trump, for the past, since 2015, has been an extraordinary challenge for the political media to cover. And I don't think, there's never been any political figure in American life quite like him. And I think from that day he came down the escalator to this today, the press doesn't really know how to cover him. And I don't have any advice because I don't have the secret of the universe. But I don't think the press has yet figured out an effective way to cover him. And every time Donald Trump is the subject of the story, he is winning. And I think that is really a problem for accountability, for the press, for it's a real challenge. And I don't know what the answer is. I mean, some coverage of him is more effective than others. I think it's best when it's very restrained and it simply says, he says this, but he did that, and here's what the documents say. If it's the lowest possible key, the least possible hysteria, the most possible information, that's the best. It's the worst when it's like, oh, the sky is falling yet again because Donald Trump did another outrageous thing. That doesn't serve anybody, I don't think. But that's just I wish I knew I could make $1 million if I.
There is one, I've noticed one change, particularly in mainstream publications like the Times, the Washington Post, maybe the Wall Street Journal too. But they now directly refer to Donald Trump falsehoods. Donald Trump falsely claimed this. So they are pointing out that used to be, that would have been, never would have happened in, most modern journalism. But the fact that they have inched over and crossed over that line where they are directly calling out lies that he propagates, that is something very, very different. Now,
if you were Biden's press secretary right now, your philosophy would be?
Your question to me, I think they are slowly turning up the volume. I mean, they basically were sort of letting Trump do his thing without kind of interfering too much with it. But they have now slowly inched back to challenging him, taking him on. because the campaign is heating up. I mean, Biden's doing more rallies. I think I personally think that they've gotten it just about right. They haven't overdone it. They haven't been too aggressive. They haven't, it's going to it's a long time to November, and it's going to get more heated as we get into the late summer and fall. But I think so far they've gotten it just about right.
Thank you all for your
Obviously,
time.
people got 2 o'clock classes they're going to.
They do, yep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all
Thank
for
you for
coming.
coming, folks.
Now you know what it's like to be a faculty member when that's